Hi everyone, I'm Gertie and I am thrilled to be introducing you to our October Patreon project. This is called the Frenchy Peignoir set. So if you're unfamiliar with what a peignoir set, and I have a feeling a lot of you probably know because this is a very vintage item. So this was historically a nightie and robe set and generally made in some sheer, frothy, fabulous fabric, lots of pastel, candy colors. And one of the things I love about this garment is that we see it in so much of pop culture. So I always think of Trudy on Mad Men wearing her peignoir sets, and Betty, of course. And then the reason we named it the Frenchy peignoir set is for Grease and that iconic slumber party scene. But so much pop culture from the mid-century, you're going to see these adorable little peignoir sets. So we went for a very authentic construction method with ours and design with ours. We used nylon tricot chiffon, and we hand dyed our colors to get these beautiful candy colors. But I do want to say you can make it in a lot of different fabrics. So if you want something a little more modern, maybe you want to make it in like a nice cotton Liberty of London lawn, that would be really beautiful too. So let's talk about some of the specifics of the pattern. So it's two pieces, a nightie and a robe, and they're meant to coordinate together, but of course you can mix and match. It has two lengths, okay? So you have your sort of like below the knee length for a very authentic 50s, 60s look. But we also gave you a floor length. So if you really want to bring the drama, you can make the full floor length. And I do want to say, because it's October, we always try to bring you something just a little extra in October that maybe you can incorporate into a Halloween costume or not, whatever you want to do. But I think this has great Halloween possibilities. And in our photo shoot this month, we showed you how to make it a little extra spooky glamour ghoul vibes. Okay, so let's look at the nightie first. So you can see this blue one. This is the one that Vera wore in the photo shoot. And this one has the sheer outer layer and then the opaque tricot lining. And then it's bound at the neckline and the armhole with bias binding. And then it has this adorable sleeve, which I based off of one of the nighties in my collection of vintage peignoirs. So just a little ruffle sleeve, which is super cute. And we finished this one off with a little satin bow in the front. And next, let's talk about the robe. Oh, but first I wanted to show you some other options for the nightie. You can either wear it nice and loose like the blue one, or we wanted to give you some options to do a sort of like cinched vibe at the waist. And this one has a sort of Grecian feel to it with a crisscross in the front. So that's created with little thread tack belt loops at the sides, but you could also just do one ribbon at the waist. And of course that's removable. And then the robe on top is so fun. So looking at the neckline, it has some gathers, and we just made the robe in the sheer layer so that you really get a lot of drama and you can see the nightie underneath. So we have binding at the neckline, just like with the nightie. There are, you can do a tie. You can either do it in ribbon, just purchase ribbon sewn on, or in this case, we did a little custom one in tubing made out of our chiffon fabric. And then we made these fabulous chiffon pom-poms, which was very much inspired by a designer who made these gowns in the mid-century named Lucy Ann. This was her sort of trademark. So separately from this video, we will be bringing you a separate tutorial on how to make these fabulous pom-poms. So watch out for that. Okay, and then the sleeve. So again, very much an authentic mid-century peignoir sleeve. This is a balloon sleeve, goes below the elbow with slight gathers at the top, slight gathers at or more gathers at the bottom. And then it has a balloon hem, which means it has a slimmer lining on the inside, and they're sewn together, and then you get that sort of bubble effect at the hem. And then looking at the body of the robe, you can see it's very, very full. It has almost a full circle of fullness, but this fabric is so light, it doesn't feel overwhelming, right? And then you also have the option to do a ruffle at the bottom, which looks really cute. So there are other design options you can do with the robe. You can see in the yellow one that Susie wore, we played around with a different material on the sleeve. We did lace, and then for a lot of structure, because if you look at the pink one, you know, it's very flowy and demure. But if you really want to get the drama in that balloon sleeve, you can put some can-can tulle underneath your outer layer, and that will give it a lot of structure. Or you could go for a softer tulle if this is a little too much drama for you. And then we contrasted this with just the tricot chiffon for the body of the gown. And that's it. So those are all of your options. Like I said, there's a ton you can do with this, from a more modern looking nightie to going full Greece mid-century. So I can't wait to see what you make with it. Let's go ahead and get started talking about the pattern and supplies. Okay, so we're going to get started by talking about the pattern pieces. So I'm going to show you the nightie pieces first, and then we'll talk about the robe pieces. So these have been scaled down so we can look at them on this little tabletop. So not a lot of pieces, but for the full length robe and nightie, they get quite big, right? So we have your nightie front, which is cut on the fold, and your nightie back, which is also cut on the fold. You have a cutting line for the shorter length version, all right? So keep that in mind. If you're not going to make the full length version, you're going to need to cut your pattern pieces. And then we have the ruffle sleeve, which is just a rectangle, and then two other rectangles for the nightie, which are an armhole binding and a neckline binding, and those both need to be cut on the bias. Next, let's look at the robe pattern pieces. So as you can see, these get enormous, especially in the full length, because we wanted a lot of fullness and circular sweep to the hem on this. So I'm going to go through the pieces, and then I'll talk about a couple tips for how, if you have narrower fabric, what you can do to economize. I will also say that because we worked with authentic vintage style fabrics for lingerie and sleepwear, those tricot fabrics come in 108 inches wide. So we were often able to get these big pieces on there, but if you want to use something narrower, I will give you some tips. But first, let's look at these big pieces. Okay, so you have your robe back, which is this one right here. It is cut on the fold. We have a few cutting lines for the back and the front, which you can see. This is a ruffle placement line, and then underneath it you will see the knee length cutting line. Then you also have your full length, floor length, fabulous robe cutting line, okay? So those are the cutting lines you're gonna have on these pieces. On the front, now this one is cut too, right? Because you have the front opening. And again, you have those cutting lines. Now, for the sleeve on the robe, this is a very full, like bishop style sleeve, but based on vintage style peignoirs, we wanted to give this a bubble hem. So if you know what a bubble hem is, you know you need to have a very full outer piece and then a slimmer lining piece that controls the fullness. And I'm going to show you how to sew this today, but it gets a really cool effect with these two pieces together. Okay, so the robe sleeve, you're going to cut in your outer fabric, whatever that may be. You'll see in the photos we did some of these in the tricot chiffon, and then we also did Susie's in lace for the sleeve only. Something sheer and that contrasts with your main robe fabric can be really beautiful. And you can also cut this additionally in tulle. So let's say you're cutting it in lace and you want to get that huge, bubble effect on the sleeve. You're going to cut the outer sleeve in your tulle as well. Then you have your sleeve lining, which I would recommend doing in just, your robe fabric. Tricot chiffon works well, or another lining fabric. Then we have some more bias binding pieces for the robe itself. The long one is for the neckline of the robe. And then you have one for, now I will say that these two shorter pieces are somewhat optional. If you're using like the stiff can-can style tulle that we used in to get that big dramatic effect with the lace sleeves on the robe, the tulle is very scratchy. So you're going to want to bind some of the seams inside of the robe to protect your skin from it. So we included binding pieces to bind first the armhole of the robe And then secondly, this hem at the bottom of the sleeve so that you don't feel that scratchiness through the fabric. Okay, so those two are optional, but definitely worth considering if you're going to be using a more textured or stiff tool. So those are your robe pieces. Let's talk really quickly about tips for cutting if you can't get these on your fabric. Okay, because like I said, I used 108-inch wide fabric for the tricot chiffon. But for something like that purple spiderweb robe that we did, that fabulous fabric is unfortunately only 60 inches wide. So I had to get a little creative with my cutting layout. So what I did, first of all, you can add seams. You can always add seams, right? So for, let's say, the back piece, it took up the entire width of 60 inches just to get this piece on there. And then it was still hanging over a little bit, right? So I obviously couldn't cut it on the fold. So instead of cutting on the fold, I added a seam at center back. Now, you can also add seams anywhere else you want, right? You could do a seam here. You could do a seam with the grain line. Whatever you need to do to get them to fit, it's going to be okay because there's so much fullness in this robe, you're not really going to see those seams. All right, so consider that. The other thing you can do, which I found really handy, if I just had like a little bit, I had this little corner hanging off of my fabric. I was like, if this robe were just a little bit narrower, I would be able to fit it on this fabric. And so if you don't mind losing fullness in the hem, and especially in the full length version, you have so much fullness that I was okay with losing a little bit of it. So what you can do is you can take out a fold at the bottom of the pattern piece like this, and just take a tuck like that, and you're going to fold it up to, you're going to go to, you don't want to fold anything out of the neckline, right? So you're going to go to nothing up here. So be very careful not to actually take anything out there. And then you can smush this down, tape it down, and take out really as much as you need. And then as you're cutting, just, cut a smooth line, obviously. But, whatever, and you can take a little bit more, a little bit less if you need, but that's how you can kind of work around this, okay? So that's what I did with that full-length robe since I had to work on 60-inch wide fabric. Okay, so let's move on and talk about supplies. Okay, so let's get started talking about supplies and fabrics. So needle-wise, we did use some knit-type fabrics, but we found that Microtex needles worked well for all the different types of fabrics that we used. So that would be my recommendation. I know people are very personal about needles though, but Microtex worked really well. Again, the thinner your fabric, the smaller your needle size should be. And then for your thread, all-purpose polyester thread, as usual, is great. Now, I do want to make some notes about the thread if you're going to dye your fabric, okay? So let's talk about tricot next, okay? So as I talked about in the intro, we based this peignoir set on a vintage peignoir set, and we wanted to go very authentic with our fabric choices. So if you look at sleepwear of this era, it was often in this slinky tricot fabric and a combination of two fabrics, the chiffon, the very sheer fabric, and then the more opaque tricot. So we used a combo of the opaque and sheer to layer in the nightie, and then the robe is just in the sheer. But the great thing about this project is you can play around with layering different fabrics and using other type woven fabrics too, okay? So there's some flexibility here. Now, this tricot is made out of nylon. And the thing about nylon is that it dyes really well. So when you look at nighties of yore, the 50s and 60s peignoir sets, they were these beautiful colors, pastels and some jewel tones. So we want, it's hard to find this tricot in anything other than black and white sometimes. So we bought a lot in white, and then we did some custom dyeing to get those beautiful frothy candy colors that we used in the shoot, which you can see here. So we used RIT dye and we used the liquid dye, and you don't have to do it on a stovetop. You can use tap water, the hottest water you can get out of your tap, and do it in a bucket or some sort of other pot and follow the directions from RIT. And RIT also has some great recipes on their website. So if you are not loving one of their pre-mixed shades, you can experiment with their recipes, and their recipes are great. We got a really beautiful shade of aqua, very 50s aqua, for Vera's nightie using their Powder Puff Blue recipe, and it came out really well. So I just want to let you know that you should check out those recipes if you're looking for something a little more custom. The other great thing is that, you can, if you get nylon ribbon or silk ribbon or something else that takes dye well, you can just dye it all together and get coordinating lace, ribbon, and have a whole, it looks like you got the most beautiful color coordinating fabrics in all different sort of substrates, but you custom did it. So it's really exciting, and it's a fun thing to play around with. The other thing I will say though is that you should definitely test all of your dye first with some swatches or just a little bit of yardage, because we found things like the lace, it was labeled as nylon, which, as I said, dyes really well, but it didn't take the dye the same as the rest of our nylon fabric. So our suspicion is that it's probably poly or has some poly in it. So you don't want to get a surprise if you sew up your robe and then dye it. Okay, so that would be my recommendation. Okay, the other thing I was going to say about dyeing and the thread is that polyester thread is not going to take dye that well. So what we did was we sewed our garments up in nylon first, and then we sewed it with the thread color to match our swatches, okay? So pink or aqua or yellow, and then dyed the entire garment. So just keep that in mind with your thread, that it might not take dye the same way that your fabric does. Okay, but that's all for dyeing. So those are your tricots. And then we also experiment with some other fabrics, like I said, lace for the sleeves. You can use tulle or flocked embroidered tulles are really beautiful for this project. I found this velvet flocked spiderweb tulle for Halloween on Etsy, and it worked really nicely. Also things like, this is called aspirin dot or Pont d'Esprit. You can use things like this, are really beautiful for either the entire thing or just a sheer outer layer on the bubble hem sleeve. Can tulle is what we use to get that structure in the robe sleeve. You can see it's very stiff. If you want just a little more structure in your sleeve, you don't have to go quite this stiff. You can use another type of tulle if you like, but this is something that you can do to just get a little bit more structure in your robe sleeves. And lastly, I just want to say that you can use woven fabrics for this project. So let's say you want to do something like a Liberty of London cotton lawn and a floral. This would be so beautiful. And in this case, you do not need to line it, right? Because you have some opacity here. So unless you want to, of course, but you wouldn't necessarily need to use the nightie lining. The other thing you can do is use a solid batiste or lawn or something like that, this is what I'm going to be sewing with today in a woven, and then take something like this really pretty patterned net and put it over, for this being the outer layer. So you're playing with texture and pattern over a solid underneath. So that looks really beautiful too. Finally, you're going to need ribbon. So the ribbon is for the ties on the robe. You can use velvet, you can use silk or nylon. You can also use this if you want to get a narrower ribbon and tie a little bow for your nightie and do a little embellishment, or get some of those little lingerie florets. So there's a lot you can do with embellishment too. But those are your main supplies. So next, let's move on to the sewing. Okay, so we're ready to start sewing. So the first thing we're going to do is put the two layers of the nightie, the lining and the outer nightie, together. So I've already constructed the side seams on each of them. Okay, so my outer nightie is going to be in this really fun dotted tulle, which I'm very excited about. And then the lining, I'm doing something a little different than we did for the samples, and using a woven for the lining. So this is that peachy cotton lawn. Okay, so all I've done so far is right sides together, nightie front to nightie back, sew, pin and sew those side seams. If you're using a woven, you're going to press those side seams open. If you're using a tulle or nylon tricot, we just kind of finger press the seams to one side on those, because you don't want to be using a lot of high heat on these materials because it will melt. And honestly, it looks fine if you just kind of finger press them to one side. Another option, of course, is French seams if you're into that kind of thing. So you could do that as well. But because there's so much fullness in these two garments, you're not going to really notice the seams all that much, okay? So I have my outer nightie and my inner nightie. I turn them both right sides out. And now I'm going to put them together by taking the lining and putting it inside the outer nightie. And you want to make sure that you're matching front to front and back to back. And the way I'm figuring that out is looking at the armhole notches, right? There's a single notch on the front armhole and a double notch on the back. And one thing to note about these armhole notches is that you don't want to clip too far with them, because we're going to be putting a binding on at 1/4 inch, right? So try not to clip past 1/4 inch. All right, and now I'm just going to pin these together around the upper edge. So you can see the wrong side of the outer nightie is facing the right side of the lining. Okay, so I'm just going to continue pinning around like this. And after I've done that, I'm going to take this to the machine and I'm going to baste the two layers together. And it's important that you only baste using a 1/4 inch seam allowance, okay? I mean, it's not a huge deal if you use a wider seam allowance, like 1/2 inch, but you will have to take those stitches out later for sure, because they will show, because that binding is only a 1/4 inch wide. So keep that in mind. Okay, so I'm going to keep pinning around here, and then I'm going to do that basting all the way around these upper edges and the armholes, and then we will come back and talk about next steps. Okay, so now I have finished doing my basting stitch, which you can see in the orange thread around the upper edge at about 1/4 inch. And so these two layers are now going to be treated as one. I love how these look together. I'm very excited about this. Okay, so what we're going to do now is just put this to the side for a minute, and we're going to talk sleeves, these little ruffle sleeves. So I wanted to tell you something a little different that I'm doing with this version, which is that instead of just using one layer, like just using the sheer on the sleeve, we decided to do an underlining situation, right? So that we could have the sheer and the peach color underneath, right? So we cut two of the outer layer, two of the inner layer, and then basted them together around the outer edges. And then these will be treated as one. Now, the next thing you're going to do with these sleeve pieces is fold them along the fold line, that long fold line, wrong sides together. Okay, so that you have a narrower rectangle here. And now I'm just going to baste these at 1/4 inch along the long raw edge. So let's do this real quick. Okay, so I'm just going to show you one. Obviously, you would do both. Okay, so here is one sleeve basted together, and now I'm going to grab my nightie. And what we're going to do is sew the sleeve to the nightie. So right sides together. And the nice thing about the sleeves is they don't have a front or a back, so you don't have to worry about that. But you are going to take the short end of the sleeve and match it, and there are circles to match here. Match it to the armhole at the neckline edge like this, and then you're going to do the same thing on the other side of the armhole, and so it's like a loop, right? And you want to make sure that it's not twisted. And I'm going to pin it on each side. And the important thing here is that all of the raw edges at the top, the sleeve, and the nightie are flush with each other. And now we're going to sew the sleeve on using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I would go back to your regular stitch length here. So I'm going to 2.5 is my stitch length. And I'm going to sew the sleeve on at a 1/4 inch. And definitely backstitch at the beginning and the end of this little seam because we want this to be very secure. And there's going to be a lot of thread tails here from all of my basting. Okay, now go to the other side of the sleeve. Same thing. Going to stitch it in place. And there we go. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do feels a little weird and out of order, but it is bind the armhole because this needs to be done before we gather the neckline and before we bind the neckline. So you are going to grab your armhole bindings, and I have cut these out just in the peach because I thought it would be pretty to have solid peach at the top here. Of course, you have options. You could do just tulle, though I will say this particular tulle gets very stretchy and it would be a nightmare to bind in. But some of the other tulles and chiffons that we used for the samples actually worked really well as bindings. So, you know, do a sample if you're not sure if it's going to be difficult to work with or not. But for this one, we're doing the woven really just to get the design contrast between the two. The other thing that you could do is you could, like I did for the sleeve, you could underline the binding and do 2 layers. But again, I also think that would be a little bit of a pain. So let me grab one of these. I'm just doing the cotton lawn. And we are going to bind this armhole. So what we're doing is isolating just the underarm curve here, and that's what we're going to bind. And we're going to be catching the sleeves in the binding. I'm going to work from the right side of the nightie, and you can see the sleeve is kind of looped down in a U shape like this. And you don't need to press your binding or anything like that. We have a notch for the underarm. So you're going to match that to the side seam on the nightie. I'm going to pin it here. And I will say that, like, pay close attention to this binding technique because we're going to use this again on the neckline. And then when you make your robe, this comes up several more times because we have a binding at the underarm of the robe, the wrist hem on the robe, and also the robe neckline. Okay, so you're going to be doing this several times. So make sure you've got your technique down. It's not hard at all. I was worried that those tricot chiffons were going to be tough to sew as a binding, and then I was like pleasantly surprised. They were very easy. Okay, so I've got pins here, and I'm going to sew this on at a 1/4 inch. And again, I'm back to my normal stitch length, which is like 2.5. Okay, so here it is sewn on, and you can see how when I flip it up, it's going to look nice and finished here. So next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to work from the inside of the garment. And what you're going to do is you're going to fold the binding in, and then you're going to fold the raw edge of the binding into itself to create this bound edge. So what you're looking for is that you want this the fold on the lower edge of the binding should cover your seam line that you just sewed on the binding. And then you're going to want to use a lot of pins. So I'm going to keep pinning like this all the way around, just continuing to turn in that binding. And we made the binding wide enough so that it would give plenty of coverage to the seam line, so that when you're going to stitch it, you can catch it in your seam line. And you can probably guess what's coming next is we're going to stitch from the right side, and you can either stitch in the ditch or stitch right next to the seam line. It's up to you. On the samples, I chose to stitch right next to the seam line. It all depends on whether you're really trying to hide your stitching or not. And extra pins are a good thing around this armhole point here, because it is like a sort of inverted point. And you can press this if you like. I think I'm going to finger press it, then sew it, and then maybe use low heat on the iron to do some finishing. But you're going to, I need to be really careful when I do that because I have that synthetic material on the mesh, which will easily melt. So I'm going to, be careful to just press the cotton binding. Okay, so as you can see, I pin from the inside because that's where you're going to be working, but now we're going to be sewing from the right side. So I'm going to stitch in the ditch, and like I said, you can either stitch in the ditch or you can stitch right next to it. Totally up to you whether you want visible stitching or not. On a lot of the fabrics that we use for the samples, you can't even see the stitching, especially like that spiderweb pattern tulle. It didn't really matter. So whatever is easiest for you, I would say, is probably a good way to go. Okay, but I'm going to stitch in the ditch just to show you how it's done. So you can see I am positioning my needle so that it is exactly within the seam line of the binding. So my stitching should be hidden. Now, granted, I am using orange thread here so that you can see it. So it's not going to blend, see, you can see that right here. It's not going to blend as well as if I actually matched my thread to my fabric. So you can see I'm catching my stitching on the wrong side, and I'm just continuing to stitch all the way around the underarm. Okay, so I'm going to finish stitching this, and then when we'll come back and we will talk about the next step, which is doing the gathering stitches. Okay, so now that we have bound the underarms, the next thing we're going to do is gather the neckline, gather the sleeves, and then in the next scene we are going to be doing the neckline binding. But first, let's focus on that gathering. So we have these very narrow seam allowances, right? Only 1/4 inch because of the binding. So you're going to need to do your gathering stitches within that seam allowance, so just within 1/4 inch. Now, you probably know that normally here at Charm, we have you do 2 rows of gathering stitches. Now, with this one, because we're using lighter fabrics and we have that tiny little seam allowance, I played around with just doing the 1 row of gathering stitches, and it worked really fine for these lightweight fabrics. So we're just going to do 1 row of gathering stitches. And the other thing to note is that you need to do the gathering stitches in 4 separate stages, right? So you're going to do, you should note that you have these circles, and mine are marked in this purple disappearing ink marker. Because you're going to gather between those on the front, and same thing on the back. You're going to gather between the purple circles. you don't want the gathering to be, in your armpit, because then you can start to get bunching there, right? And so then you're going to need to gather the sleeves separately. So from seam to seam, you're going to gather the sleeves. So that means you're going to do it in 4 separate stages: front, back, sleeve, and sleeve. Okay, so let's just start with doing I believe this is the front. You're going to go to a 4 millimeter stitch length, 4 to 5. And I'm going to start at this purple circle that's 2 inches in from the armhole. And like I said, you just want to stitch right next to your 1/4 inch basting stitch. Okay, so I'm at my next purple circle, so I'm going to stop. I'm going to make sure I have nice long thread tails for gathering. And I'm just going to show you the sleeve next. So the sleeve, you can actually start at the seam line. And stop just shy of the seam line. And then I would repeat the same thing for the nightie back between those purple circles and then the other sleeve. Okay, I'm going to do those off camera. So the next thing we're going to do is start to pull up those gathering stitches. So from the wrong side, the bobbin thread side, you are going to start to pull up the gathers. And this is just, a general. You won't know until you put the binding on how you need to distribute the gathers, or if you have, if it's enough gathers or you need to loosen it up a little, but that's fine. Just kind of, it's like sketching it in, right? You're just going to gather that there. And then same thing on the sleeve. Now the sleeve is quite gathered. It's very roughly, right? So you're going to want to really pack those gathers in there. And so on, right? Okay, so I'm just going to keep gathering until I have a nice, look how cute that's going to look. I have a nice concentrated gather on my sleeve. Okay, so I'm going to do that, continue the gathering process, and then in the next chapter, we're going to come back and we are going to do the neckline binding. So I have finished pulling up the gathering stitches, so you can see my little sleeves are nice and ruffled. I've got gathering at center front and center back of the nightie. Now, one thing to note is that you are going to want to identify which is the front and the back of your nightgown, which can be kind of hard to tell because they look very, very similar. So I just put a pin on the back of mine because we're going to be sewing on the binding starting at the left back shoulder. Okay, so next thing you're going to want to do is take out your neckline binding piece, and you're going to sew the short ends together, right sides together at 5/8 of an inch, and then press that seam line open so that we have a ring. And this is going to be the neckline binding. So like I said, you're going to start matching this at the left back shoulder. Okay, so this seam, remember where we bound the armholes? We're going to start there. So you're going to want to make sure that the armholes are, the seam allowances are facing towards the sleeve, right? And then I'm going to start by matching the seam lines on the binding to the nightie. And then you have marks on the binding piece. There are circles, and so the next circle will be at the next match point, which is the next sleeve seam. And then you have a circle, so circles at each of the sleeve seams, if that makes any sense. So 4 places that we are matching the binding to the nightie. So start by just putting pins there. And now the next thing we're going to do is to fill out these pins, fill pins in between the 4 match points. And this is where you can start to distribute the gathers the way they need to be based on the size of the binding, right? So you want it to, you don't want the binding to be too loose compared to the gathers or too tight. They should fit together 1 to 1. So once you're happy with how the gathers are distributed, then you can pin them in place like this. Pin the binding to the nightie. And this takes a little while because you have to do the front, you have to do each sleeve, and you can see I got a little overzealous on gathering my sleeve. So just very gently, I'm going to release some of these gathers so that the binding matches the sleeve itself. All right, and now I'm going to pin these 2 pieces together. And I'm going to continue around the neckline like this. Okay, so this is going to take me a few minutes, so I'm just going to keep going with this, and then we'll come back and we will sew the binding to the neckline. Okay, so you can see that I have pinned the binding on all the way around the neckline. So this is what it should look like. You can see the gathering stitches like densely populated in those 4 areas. So I'm going to stitch the binding to the nightie using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I'm going to stitch right outside my basting stitches so that they don't show. And make sure you're at your regular stitch length, 2.5. And again, anytime you see this sleeve binding, you're going to want to make sure that the binding gets pressed towards the sleeve. And we're going to stitch all the way around the neckline like this. And again, you're going to just need to check regularly to make sure that your binding and your seam allowances are flush here. And I would be really careful with the gathers to make sure that they're not, you know, like twisted, or that you're not going to see any of the little raw, ruffly edges on the right side, because that's really easy to happen in these dense gathers. But that's it. I'm going to stitch all the way around like this at a 1/4 inch. I have sewn on the binding all the way around the neckline, so you can see how cute it's going to get once it gets flipped up. And the next steps that we're going to do are just like you did on the underarm binding. Okay, so here is where the join was on the binding, so I'll just start there. But again, you're just going to turn in the raw edge and then fold it over the seam line. And same thing, I want to pin from the wrong side, but I'm going to sew from the right side. So you just want to make sure that that little fold on the bottom is going to get caught if you stitch in the ditch, or like I said, you know, you still have the option, you could stitch right next to it, like an edge stitch would be fine too. But I'm going to do stitch in the ditch just to match what I did on the underarm. And I'm just going to keep going around like this, pinning from the inside. It's going to take me a little while, and then my next step will be to stitch in the ditch from the right side. Okay, so I'm going to, this is what it's going to look like at the neckline. It's going to be so cute. I'm going to finish those steps, and then we'll come back and talk about finishing work. Okay, so I finished the neckline binding, and now we are going to talk through some of the finishing work for the nightie. Now, hem-wise, on most of our samples, we did not hem either the inner or the outer layer, because things like tulle and the nylon tricot, you don't have to hem them. They actually look better just with a clean cut. Okay, so you don't have to worry about the outer layer here. If you used a woven at all, you're going to want to hem it. So like for my peach lining, I'm going to just turn this up, you know, however much shorter you want it to be than the outer nightie. So I would say maybe a 1/4 inch. Turn it up and then top stitch. You could also use a 3-step narrow hem like we've used on lightweight fabrics before in videos. So that's your hem. Other little finishing things you might want to do, you can add a little bow at center front. So you would just get some ribbon, like this pretty peach ribbon. You tie a bow and tack it at center front on the nightie neckline. And then finally, I just wanted to talk about those waist ties we did, especially that Grecian ribbon waist tie we did. So we created those by making belt loops on the side seam of the nightie. And what I would recommend is that you try the nightie on and kind of mock this up. And this is how we did it in the studio, was that I tried the nightie on and then we wrapped the ribbon around me and kind of safety pinned it in place where it looked best. You need 2 belt loops, one that should be at your underbust, like kind of where your bra line would be. And then the second would be at your natural waist. And then you thread the ribbon through so it comes through this way, cross it in the front, and then tie it in the back. So you get that Grecian look in the front. You could also just create 1 belt loop on each side and just do like a tie, a simple, tie waist rather than crossing it in the front. So the way to create the belt loops is to create those thread chains. And we did a video on this for the Las Vegas halter top. So you can go back and revisit that. But what you're going to do is create a little loop with your thread chains, one at the underbust and then one at your natural waist, that, you want the loop to be wide enough for the ribbon to pass through. So you would start and you're going to make sure you go through both layers, okay? So start on one side and then make a thread chain and anchor it on the other side of where the ribbon would go so that you have a nice little belt loop to thread through. And that is it for your nightie. So next we're going to move on to some of the skills you'll need for sewing the robe. So I'm going to show you how to do the balloon sleeve with the bubble hem, which is a really cool, dramatic looking sleeve. I'm going to talk a little bit about the different fabrics you can use. I want to show you today how to do the really, really full version with the tulle underlining. So you can see what I have here is the dotted tulle that I made the outer layer of the nightie in. And then I've pinned to it another layer of a layer of this can tulle. So we got this from Mood Fabrics. It's a stiff tulle and it just gives you a huge balloon shape for your sleeve. So like I said earlier, you don't have to use this really stiff tulle. You can use a softer tulle, or you can do no underlining at all if you want just more of a soft shape for your sleeve. But I'm going to start out with underlining. I'm going to baste these 2 layers together. Okay, and I will say that the upper edge of the sleeve, here I would do a 1/4 inch up here, and then you can really do 1/2 inch everywhere else. Anywhere that there's going to be binding, that's where we have 1/4 inch seam allowances on this pattern. So I will start on this upper edge of the sleeve with a 1/4 inch. And another little helpful hint I want to give you guys is that anytime you have, you're basting or sewing 2 fabrics together and you have one fabric that's kind of tricky to sew, you want to put that trickier fabric on the bottom and it helps stabilize it. So for instance, this dotted tulle is a little bit tricky because like I said earlier, it keeps stretching out. If you put it on the bottom as you're sewing it, so closer to the feed dogs, then it will help stabilize it and you won't be dealing with it stretching and getting misshapen. But that rule applies really anywhere. So just 2 tricky fabrics, the trickier one goes on the bottom. Okay, so that is basting at a 1/4 inch. And then I'm going to switch to 1/2 inch everywhere else because I have 5/8 of an inch seam allowances on the rest of the garment. And I'm just going to keep basting all the way around this sleeve. And then the next step will be to sew the underarm seam on the sleeve. Okay, so I've finished my basting stitches around the outer edge, and then I sewed the underarm seam on the sleeve. Now, this is another place where you're gonna wanna be careful about pressing. You could try using the very lightest with a press cloth, but this stuff, especially the tulle, melts so easily. So I would recommend just finger press it to one side so you don't have to worry about it. And you can see with the can tool in here how much structure you get from it. So like I said, you can play around with different fabrics and get the effect that you want. Okay, next thing we're gonna do is gathering stitches. So we're gonna gather the upper edge of the sleeve, and this robe and the nightie are raglan sleeves, which means it has that diagonal seam that goes from the underarm to the neckline. So this is actually the neckline right here. So just like we did with the nightie, we're going to gather within that seam allowance. So you're going to use just a tiny little seam allowance under a 1/4 inch here and just do one row of gathering stitches. And leave those nice tails for gathering. And now on the lower edge of the sleeve, we have a bigger seam allowance, so I would recommend doing your usual 2 rows of gathering here. So I'm going to do one at 1/2 inch and one at a 1/4 inch, starting at the underarm seam. So that's one row at 1/2 inch, and now the next will be at 1/4 inch or a little less. Okay, so now I'm going to spend a little time pulling up those bobbin threads. I will tell you that the upper edge of the sleeve here does not have a lot of gathers to it at all. It's just lightly gathered, so you're not going to need to really pull it up tightly, right? Just put a few little gathers in there. And then you'll be able to distribute them when we line this up with the sleeve lining. And then on the lower edge, this is more densely gathered, so you can pull this up a bit more. Now the can tool makes it a little bit difficult to gather, so I would say just take your time and don't break a thread. And so I'm going to keep going with this, and we will come back in the next step and I'll talk about sewing this to the lining. Okay, I've finished gathering up my sleeve, and you can see how structural, we were just laughing about how structural this can tool is. And yeah, if you want something really dramatic, this looks great. So if you're thinking more costume, burlesque kind of vibes, this is really great. But you can do it without the tool to get a softer look, or even a softer tool. So there's a lot of different options. Okay, so now we're going to put this together with the sleeve lining. So I cut the sleeve lining from the peach woven fabric. And you have some options, again, like what you want to cut it from. Do you want it to match the outer sleeve or not? And what you're going to do is put the outer sleeve inside, am I doing this right? Yeah, inside the lining so that they are right sides together. And you're going to match those underarm seams and pin them. So I'm going to make sure my gathers are evenly distributed around the sleeve hem. Oops. This is a little weird to maneuver. And next thing I'm going to do is sew these together around this circle. But it's going to take me a little while to get this pinned, just because you want to make sure the gathers are nice and smooth as possible in this fabric. Okay, and now this is the kind of thing you can put on the free arm of your machine, or if you don't have a free arm, and actually what I'm going to do is I want to sew it with the gather side up. So I'm just going to sew it in the round like this. So that I can keep an eye on these gathers. And I'm stitching at 5/8 of an inch. Okay, I've finished sewing around the sleeve hem, and here I'm going to want to trim this seam allowance down. So you can trim it down to 1/4 inch, because especially if you're using this very stiff tool, you're going to want to do a binding on this seam allowance. So because it does get very scratchy. So for that purpose, we have included a binding piece for this seam allowance and for the underarm, just anywhere that this could potentially irritate your skin. So those are optional, of course, because you may be using something not so scratchy. But this is where you would now do the binding process just like we did on the nightie. So stitch it on at 1/4 inch, flip in those raw edges, and then stitch in the ditch or edge stitch to encase the tulle seam allowances there. Okay, so you would do that next. So if you're going to bind the seam allowance, if you're not, that's fine. But the next thing you're going to do is turn the lining right side out, and then you're going to flip it to the inside of the sleeve. So this, I don't think I would actually sew these two fabrics together like this, but I think it's a nice, like I would probably do something sheer and white on the inside. But I think this is a nice illustrative purpose where you can see that the sleeve lining is like a stay that holds everything in place and creates that bubble shape at the hem. So next thing we're going to do is put the underarm curves together, and these are going to be basted. So just pin these together for now. And then the upper edge of the sleeve where we did the gathering earlier, you are going to distribute those gathers and also pin that together. So the lining kind of acts like a stay for the gathers because it's completely ungathered, and it should give you a sense of how much you need to distribute the gathers at the top there. And yeah, it's not a lot, you can see, so I can just go ahead and pin this. A lot of threads here. And I'm just going to release some of these gathers. And then I'm going to baste these raw edges together. And then this will be ready to sew into the robe. At the upper edge here, I would really just use the 1/4 inch seam allowance again, okay? Because you don't want anything that you're going to have to remove where the binding is, because it's just a very narrow seam allowance. So I'm basting, I'm using that 4mm stitch length, basting along the upper edge here. So I'm going to keep basting around this armhole. When I pivot to the underarm, I'm going to use a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Okay, so I'm going to keep going with this, and then we're going to come back and we're going to talk about finishing touches for the robe. Okay, I just want to talk through some of this robe finishing techniques, because like I said, much of it is the exact same as the nightie, right? So you can see here's my, I'm using this beautiful purple spider web to demonstrate. And this has the can tulle on the inside and then is lined with black tricot chiffon. So you can see what the bubble hem looks like on the inside. It's super cool. So you would set this into your, sew your robe side seams, set the sleeve into the robe, and then we did provide an optional binding piece to bind the underarm seam to protect your skin from the tulle if it's scratchy. And then you're going to gather around the neckline and apply the neckline binding almost exactly like you did for the nightie, but it's a little different because there's an opening at center front, so you don't have to close it into a ring. You just start at center front and go around, bind to the opposite side of the opening, okay? And that's pretty much how you sew the robe. It's so simple, and it has many of the same steps as the nightie. But I did also want to talk about how to do some ties at the neckline. So because we are using materials that don't fray, and that really look best when you do the least to them. The center front of the robe, we just turned the seam allowance in, so 5/8 of an inch at the neckline, and then just let it hang all the way down, did not hem the bottom of the robe. And we did velvet ribbon ties for this one. And so just turn in the edge of the ribbon, place it onto the neckline, and then stitch in a little square around there, and do that on both sides. And we had the ties go, because this was one of the more dramatic robes we made, we had the ties go all the way down to the floor. But do keep in mind, we're going to have that little pom-pom tutorial coming up for you if you want to do that chiffon pom-pom touch at the end of your ties. But that is really it for this robe. It's so simple, but it's so dramatic at the same time. Ta-da! Okay, everyone, that is it. That is how you sew your Frenchy peignoir set. I hope you love this project. We have learned a lot today, like how to do a continuous bias binding around the neckline of the nightie. We have also talked about how to sew with these very authentic materials like the tricot chiffon. And then we learned how to do this fabulous balloon sleeve. So I hope that you've loved learning all of this, and don't forget to tag me in what you make with this pattern and use the hashtag Frenchy peignoir set. And I just want to thank you all so much for your support here on Patreon. It really means the world to us and lets us continue to make this content every month. So thanks for being a patron, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.